Hello, welcome to the Tillage Edge, Teagasc's new weekly tillage podcast with me, Michael Hennessy. During these uncertain times, Teagasc is committed to making sure farmers are kept up to date with the latest information, and this information on our weekly podcast series is one way of keeping you informed. And for our first episode, I'll be discussing nitrogen strategies with Teagasc researcher Dr. Richie Hackett. I first asked Richie about winter barley yield potential following the poor winter.
There's a wide diversity of crops out there, as most growers will be aware, and there are some quite good crops with good yield potential. You know, they have a good plant population, lots of tillers. Then there, at the other end of the scale, there's some very patchy crops with plants that are struggling, and those crops' yield potential will be impacted. But I think in general, crops will improve a lot over the next 2 to 3 weeks, as there are a lot of new tillers appearing on barley crops, and I think yield potential will be quite a bit better than many growers would have expected, say 3 or 4 weeks ago.
Okay, and I think a lot of farmers probably recognise that some of their crops weren't as good as they would have liked. And many farmers were out in early February, or maybe even a little bit later on in February, but we've had a lot of rain in the meantime. What's your opinion as regards the nitrogen there? Will we be able to trap all that nitrogen, or is some of it lost to the crop?
Well, I suppose there were two spreading opportunities. There was one at the very beginning of February, and then there was one sort of last week of February, very early March. I think for the nitrogen that was applied in late February, early March, that nitrogen should be fully available, and I wouldn't have any worries about that nitrogen. For the nitrogen that was applied at the very beginning of February, where there was very low uptake of nitrogen all through February, plus a high potential of loss with all the rain that we got, it's difficult to say, but it's unlikely that all of that nitrogen will be still available to the crop. But putting a number on how much will have been lost is very, very difficult. But 10-20% may have been lost out of the soil. But
of that proportion.
To be definitive.
So it's 20% of the proportion, applied in February. Okay. So as you rightly say, crops have been, I suppose, maybe not growing as strongly, but the weather over this week will push them on very quickly. And I think farmers are out there constantly assessing crops to see how good they are, and maybe the yield potential might be building a little bit in their mind. Most of the nitrogen is applied, I think, to winter barley at this stage. Where guys were maybe holding back a little, do you think there's any opportunity, or how should guys approach maybe a final nitrogen application to these crops if they think that the yield potential is a little better now than it was maybe a couple of weeks ago?
Yeah, well, I suppose many growers would be using a third split anyway, and they still won't have that applied. So that gives them the opportunity to go and reassess their crops and decide whether the crop actually justifies that third split, or whether it maybe should the crop is not as good as they thought it would be, and maybe they should hold back on that. But it certainly gives them the opportunity to apply extra nitrogen if the crop is improved compared to what they originally thought. And I mean, you would normally apply the third split somewhere between growth stage 32 to 37, so before the flag leaf has emerged. So that gives growers another 10 days, maybe 2 weeks, to make a final decision on the total amount of nitrogen that they should apply to their crops.
For, I suppose, the general winter barley crop, are we talking about roughly the same level of nitrogen? What sort of levels are they?
I don't think I would. So there's two reasons why you might make an adjustment to barley, and indeed other crops. Is we had a very wet winter, and growers may be worried there was less nitrogen coming into the soil coming into the springtime, and that may well be so. But I think the differences, any adjustments on that basis, should be very small, 10, maybe at most 20 kilos per hectare. The second reason you might adjust your nitrogen this year is because of lower yield potential. And in that case, you'd be looking at reducing, if you thought your crop was going to be maybe 1 ton a hectare lower than it would normally be, you might reduce your nitrogen by about 20 kilos per hectare. I would not reduce my nitrogen inputs to crops by much more than about 40 kilos would be the absolute most I would reduce my nitrogen inputs to a crop. You've obviously got to remember that if you put on less nitrogen, you're going to get a lower yield, even if that crop had potential for higher yield. So it's a very delicate decision in terms of reducing the amount of nitrogen. By all means, if the crop is compromised in terms of yield potential, do reduce your nitrogen somewhat, but don't go overboard on it.
Okay, that's great, Richie. Look, we might just move on a little bit and go and maybe have a touch on winter wheat. It probably fared a little bit wetter, I'd say, or a little bit better over the winter, given the fact that it's a little bit more resilient. Where do you see the yield potential of the majority of crops out there?
Well, I suppose unlike barley, which is you need lots of ears per square meter, in wheat, ears per square meter is less of a driver of yield. And once you have somewhere in the range of 400 to 600 ears per square meter, you have potential for good yield. And I think many crops have established reasonably well as reasonable plant populations, in some cases very good plant populations. And wheat seems has been tillering well and will continue to tiller well. So I think for a lot of wheat crops, there will be good yield potential. I suppose every field will have areas within it where it has been drowned out or whatever, which will reduce the field yield potential, but the actual potential of the areas where there's reasonable plant populations will be quite good. So I think wheat will probably fare better than barley,
okay,
relatively speaking.
Okay, and just as a follow-on to that, in terms of the growth stages of where the majority of wheat is now, obviously it was sown a little bit later this year, so there might be a little bit behind in comparison to normal. Whereabouts is the growth stage, and if we're looking at nitrogen application to wheats, what's the ideal growth stages we should be aiming for to stick maybe the first one and maybe the main split on?
Well, of the crops I've seen, which would have been sown between the middle of October and the middle of November, the slightly earlier ones are coming up to growth stage 30. Some varieties may be at growth stage 30, and some of them are still, maybe depending on weather, maybe a week away from growth stage 30. In terms of timing of nitrogen, we would usually suggest that you would have your first split on by around growth stage 30, and then you would be applying your second split and have it on by around growth stage 31. So I guess most growers will have their first split of nitrogen on with the compound already, and they'll be contemplating their second split. So I would suggest their second split sometime next week for a lot of crops will be that's the week after Easter. That will be when they will be going with their second split. But obviously it will depend on the individual crop.
So in terms of the balance, Richie, for the quantities of nitrogen, are guys, would 2 splits get out, or is it 3 splits, or what sort of quantities would you suggest?
Well, I think in this season a third split might be a good idea. Or I suppose we would normally recommend a third split where you're applying in excess of 150 kilos a hectare for environmental reasons more so than for yield reasons. But in this season, it might be a good idea to go with a third, allow yourself the option of a third split, and you can reassess your crop later in the season when you have a better idea of what its yield potential is, and then apply your nitrogen if the crop justifies it. In terms of sort of the quantities to apply at the different growth stages, typically if you were going with a 3 split program, you might look at something like putting on a quarter of it in the first split, half it in the second split, and hold back maybe a quarter or a little bit less for your third split. And that's probably a good strategy in this season, and you can decide how much of the third split to apply, if at all, when the time comes, when you have a better idea of what your crop looks like.
Okay, so there's still plenty of time then to get your nitrogen onto winter wheats. The bit I just want to touch on now is the fact that not every crop did as well as you would have liked, and certainly some farmers have decided that winter wheat crops that went in maybe in not so great conditions and didn't fare well, they now have to resow it with some sort of a spring crop. Where fertilizer has been applied to that crop, if you like, and are going in with the new crop for that, say nitrogen or even P and K, will that still be available to the next crop?
Yes. So the P and K will still be there, and obviously if you're just resowing a crop and you decide you must put on more P and K, even though the stuff that you applied is already still there, you need to take into account your nitrates allocations. The nitrogen will also be there, so I wouldn't have any worries about that. The nitrogen that was applied to the crop before you ploughed it in or cultivated it in, I would treat that as part of my main split, and I would still apply some nitrogen in the seed bed to the emerging crop, the resown crop, as the nitrogen may have moved down the soil a little bit and mightn't be immediately available to the new crop, but it will still be present.
Okay, and that's probably important from a financial point of view, because it might be a little bit tricky to make money on the resown crop, because a lot of money spent already. So if you can include that, if you like, in the total NP and K of the new crop going in, I think that'll help for the overall economics. Just switching a little bit now to just switching this now a little bit to winter oats, Richie. They're probably the crop that's probably the best, maybe because of the growth stage or the way it stands up in the ground, but they're looking reasonably well. Now, Teagasc have done a lot of work to the late Dr. John Finnan in terms of nitrogen work in oats. You might just give us an outline of how that research has changed our management for winter oats in terms of nitrogen.
Well, I suppose before John did the work, advice regarding oats would generally maybe have been to put on maybe about a third of your nitrogen in the first split and 2/3 in your second split. But John did quite a lot of work looking at different timings and splittings of nitrogen in oats, and what he clearly showed was that timing often didn't have a very big effect on yield, but it could have a very big effect on your hectolitre weight, which obviously has considerable consequences for the price you get at the end of the day. And what he found basically was that it was better to apply half your nitrogen in the first split, so around growth stage 30, and the remaining half at around somewhere between growth stage 31 and 32. And that reduced the risk of having a negative effect on your hectolitre weight compared to previously when we were going with a third in the first split and 2/3 in the second split. Now the clear recommendation is to go 50-50 in the two splits to divide your total nitrogen evenly across the two splits.
Okay, we still have plenty of time for that. I think most winter oats are only around growth stage 30, so there's still lots of time for guys to get out there and put that on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, most guys will have their first split on already on winter oats, and the second split will probably come around quite quickly now if the weather warms up, but we would still be looking at next week, so the week after Easter probably.
Just finally, Richie, I'm going to ask you a quick question on Malting Barley, as most of it's in the ground now, and we probably have some of it just about going to break ground. There's probably a good bit of nitrogen probably put in the seedbed of lots of crops, but many growers will still apply a top dressing. Do you think this year is any different to other years in terms of we might be a little bit later than we would have liked maybe planting Malting Barley, and also given the fact there was maybe a wetter year and there might be less residual nitrogen coming from the soils?
Well, I suppose first on the sowing date, I think that the vast majority of barley will have been sown in March, which I wouldn't consider late, even though in growers in some areas might like to have it sown in the first half of March. The vast majority of it was sown by the end of March. And I suppose that the other point to make is all crops are sown into really excellent seed beds, which sets them up for good yield potential. So that I wouldn't adjust my nitrogen based on the sowing date in the current season. In terms of your second point regarding following a very wet winter that we've had, yes, the amount of nitrogen in the soil at the start of the season may be lower compared to normal situations, but the amount of nitrogen that the crop gets from the soil will depend on as much on what's released from the soil between now and harvest as it does what's in the soil at the start of the season, and that's as yet unknown. So I suppose in short, I wouldn't make any changes to my nitrogen input in the current season based on the wet winter. And given that if I had good sowing conditions, I think I would be using what I would normally apply to my crop, be it a stilling crop or a brewing crop, and I would go with that rather than making any drastic changes to my input.
Yes, Richie, and I think that's a good point, just to make the differentiation between brewing and distilling. That certainly the distilling, we're aiming for a lower protein content, and probably should have a little bit less nitrogen applied to those crops. So Richie, I just want to thank you very much for joining us here on this inaugural Tillage Edge podcast. So thanks very much for your time.
No problem. Thank you for having me, Michael.
That's it for my first episode of the Teagasc Tillage Edge, and my thanks to Dr. Richie Hackett for joining me on the show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe on Apple Podcast and Spotify so you never miss a show. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.